Hey everyone, in week 8, we're returning from spring break, and I'll be meeting with folks to talk about their midterm projects and their research journals. And we also begin a series of conversations about the different tools that researchers use in our discipline to answer research questions. And in this week, in week 8, we're thinking about observations. So in this video, I'll react and kind of reflect on what I thought are some of the more significant points in Blakesley and Fleischer about observations and about research methods in kind of a broader sense and how they're used in the discipline. So to begin with, I want to touch on some of the really important points that Blakesley and Fleischer made about research methods. Not about observations necessarily, but those earlier few pages of that chapter where they're talking about choosing research methods and how to think about going into the process of conducting research. There's a really important point early on where they're talking about the alignment between research questions and research methods. Your methods need to align with your research question. And this is why I'm kind of a jerk about making sure that your research question is just so, because the wording matters. If you're asking a research question about how a particular variable correlates with a particular outcome, that is a question that is not as well suited to interviews and observations as survey research. So survey research, you could say, I have this variable in a survey instrument, and it is this thing that I want to test for, and I want to see if it correlates with other things. That is more of a quantitative project. And so that research question wouldn't lend itself very well to some of the other more qualitative approaches that we're going to talk about in this class. The thing that's pretty cool about research questions and the alignment to research methods is that the choices, I don't want to say they narrow really, but it kind of forces your hand. The research question kind of forces your hand. If you're trying to understand how people are perceiving something, it's going to be hard for you to do that kind of research just by reading a bunch of journal articles or by just looking at surveys. You really need to get out there and talk to people about their perception. So the alignment between your research methods and your research question is a super important issue to think about. And I've seen folks just kind of like disregard research because they say, I'm trying to do this thing, I'm trying to answer this question, but then they're using tools that are just not well suited to answering that question. Another thing that I want to mention is that Blakesley and Fleischer, they talk about, testing out methods and trying different methods on to kind of see what you're comfortable with. And that's what I see this class as. You're going to try observations, you're going to try surveys, we're going to try interviews. You're going to try some of these different tools that researchers in this discipline use, and you'll see what works for you. And you're going to try them out in the context of your research project. You don't have to in every circumstance because some of these methods aren't going to work for some of the topics that you all are thinking about. I don't know if James is going to be able to observe teachers freaking out about ChatGPT. I don't know if a survey is really going to help Alan out very much with his project around tabletop role-playing games. So, it might work, but what I'm trying to say is that some of these things aren't going to align neatly, and I want you guys to be patient with it, to not get too frustrated. Some of these methods are going to jive better with your skills and with your disposition, and I want you all to be okay with that. And just, if there's some that just don't work for you, that's fine. Maybe it's a research tool that you can come back to at a later point. But I want you to get kind of a breadth of understanding of the different tools that are used in the discipline. So be open to that and kind of give yourself a little bit of grace if things start to get a little frustrating. Something that Blakesley and Fleischer talk about that I really appreciate is the conversation around mindset and disposition when it comes to research, because it really does matter in the kind of research that we do. If you go into research thinking about, I need to get this interview done, that is a different mindset than thinking about that interview that you're going to do as a way to understand somebody's perspective behind or about a phenomenon that you're looking into. if you look at research as just trying to find the right answer, to tick a box, to just, I need to get 6 interviews done, and then I'm on my way. I think you're going to struggle with this kind of research. So, what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of ambiguity with the work that we do, with the kind of research that we do in the discipline. We definitely get, there's definitely rigor, and there's definitely standards and guidelines for doing research in our discipline, and we're definitely going to talk about that stuff. But there are parts of the research process where things are pretty gray and where things can be kind of frustrating. But if you go into it in the mindset, I'm curious about something, and this work that I'm doing is trying to get at answering something that I'm curious about, that is a mindset that I think is going to sustain you through a research project. At least that's been the experience in my research that I've done. And finally, before I get to the observation stuff, the conversation around reading I thought was kind of interesting. And I like that they remind us that reading is a super important part of the discipline. Nobody does research in this discipline without kind of acknowledging the people that come before that have done other kinds of studies, like Nancy Summers and Lisa Eade, and lots of folks that have just done kind of set the groundwork for further studies to come along. So your reading matters, and we'll talk about that with your research journals. We'll talk about that in the context of your literature review. But you need to show that you've done your research and that you know the discipline before you go off and do your research project. So reading and thinking about the different contexts and purposes that you're using reading for, I thought that was a good reminder in this chapter of Blakesley and Fleischer. Reading something with the purpose of analyzing it is and should be a very different process than reading something to put together a literature review. You should be reading much faster to do that, to do the latter activity. One thing that I like, now that we're talking about observations, one thing that I really like that Blakesley and Fleischer do is on page 105, there's a conversation about the different contexts in which you would conduct an observation. That is super helpful stuff. I can't underscore that enough. Later in the semester, you're going to write a methods section for a potential project, and I think you'll want to point to places like this throughout the book. And they do this in other places. Like when they talk about interviews, like these are the ways, or these are the kind of contexts in which interviews would be helpful. We'll do the same thing for some of the other research methods we'll come across. Being able to point to some of that and to align the project that you're working on with text like that, with Blakesley and Fleischer and what they're saying about observations, whatever, and what it's able to do, that is super helpful for a methods section, because it bolsters your credibility as a researcher to say, I'm using this method. Here's why. Here's why this method is suited to this kind of research that I'm doing. So it's all about credibility building and building that connection, that alignment with that research question. Super important work to do in a method section. And I like that Blakesley and Fleischer call that out on page 105. Super helpful stuff. A few other things about observations in that chapter. One is the conversation about making the familiar unfamiliar. I hope that concept makes sense. So to give you an example, when I go to Kroger and to pick up Triscuits, and I love Triscuits, don't come at me with the wheat thin stuff. But when I'm going to Kroger to pick something up, I'm not really thinking too critically about what I'm observing there, or what's going on. It's a process that I'm just trying to get through, and I'm just trying to get out of there so I can go eat my Triscuits in the parking lot. But if I was to ask a research question, and say the research question had to do about the culture of that Kroger, or if it's about workplace processes in that workspace, then that's those. Like, I should be trying to think of that place in a very different light. That question should force me to look at that place in a very different light. I would want to try to forget and kind of push aside my preconceptions and what I've kind of take for granted about that place, and try to see it through a different perspective, and to, really kind of highlight the process, and the processes that are going on there, and describe those processes. So that making the familiar unfamiliar is a really important thing, and it sounds kind of abstract and kind of weird, but it's an important thing about conducting a good observation. You're taking something that we kind of take for granted, and you're saying, hey, let's look at this in a different way. It can be a really cool thing that you end up doing. Another really important concept in that chapter about observations, and something I can talk about from my experience doing this kind of research, is the concept of thick description. And yes, I know, when I've taught this to undergrads, they've also spelled it THICC. Go for it in your discussion board posts in the next few weeks. Have at it. But that thick description thing is it's super important to qualitative research in a general sense, and it's absolutely essential to observations. I'd say observations and interviews are really important there as well. But that thick description thing, why it's so important is because you're trying to understand a culture, you're trying to understand somebody's perception, and sometimes the words that they say don't convey everything. And particularly when we're talking about observations, the words that you hear people say may not be nearly as important as some of the nonverbal cues that you're picking up on, as the arrangement of desks in a classroom, just the interpersonal communication habits of two people that are in a disagreement. Like, there's so much to pick up on, and there's maybe too much to pick up on, and that's something that they also talk about in this chapter, is like knowing when to say when it comes to your description, and with recording things. But with thick description, what you're really trying to do is you're trying to put your readers in the perspective of being at that observation, of being at that Kroger, and seeing what's going on, and being able to use interesting and important details that are shedding light on that phenomenon. Again, everything is aligning and going back to that research question. The description should help readers understand a component of that, of the research question, of the findings. So being able to use that really rich description, it's not about, padding a paper or bullshitting or anything like that. It's about helping people really understand context and understand how the interplay of different research participants, how it helps, like what you're observing is helping you answer a research question. And it's not going to be in just what people say. It's about the connections between people. It's about the connections between people and that, and the physical environment around them. And that description brings it home to participants. It's one of my favorite aspects of doing qualitative research, because you get to do, it's not creative writing, but it's really good descriptive writing, which is a key component of creative writing. So that's something I'll be looking for this week in the work that you do. Thick description. Whether you spell it CK or CC, I don't care. There's a lot of talk about note-taking in this chapter, and I'm going to ask you to try out a note-taking method. What has helped me when I've conducted observations is to, I've used a few different methods, but I've used you fold a piece of paper, taco style, or no, not taco style, hot dog style, and then that's the long way, and then you write on one side facts, things that aren't really up for interpretation. This person said this. This person got up at 2 minutes into the observation and walked across the room and sat down in this other place. And then on the right-hand side, I've written notes about like my interpretations, trying to keep track of like what are the things that have actually happened, and then what are my impressions about those things that have happened. That's one approach. There's a lot of other methods that Blakesley and Fleischer talk about, and I urge you to try out one or two that are going to work for you. So note-taking methods are really important. Some other logistical concerns to think about. I want to talk about those really quick. One, depending upon the context in which you are going to conduct your observation, you want to get the consent of the people that you're observing. I also don't want anybody to put themselves in a difficult position and observe a place where you may not be welcome, and like just start creeping on people with a clipboard or something on like that, and start writing things down. If you're really observing, you can if you're observing and people are conscious of the fact that you're observing, you might say something to them that this is for a class project, and maybe not leave it, maybe not give any more detail than that. Typically, when you tell people that they're observing them, they're going to change their behaviors a little bit. So balance that as you see fit this week when you're trying things out. If you use observations as a research method for your project, we'll want to talk about like how you go about doing that, how you get consent, how you minimize your role as a researcher in that culture that you're trying to study, because your presence really does matter. And that kind of gets us to some of the ethics stuff. But, making sure that you have permission and consent from permission from supervisors or something like that at a place that you're conducting an observation, and make sure that you get the consent of the people that you are observing. Important things to think about. I also kind of just like logistic wise, I'm a shit artist, but I draw out like where things are configured because I forget that over time. Place really kind of matters to me, and being able to locate people that I'm observing in space and knowing where they are kind of matters. So sometimes I'll take pictures of something that I'm observing, of a place that I'm observing, and then kind of like remind myself that like, yeah, these people were seated over here. I'm not taking pictures of people that I'm observing. That's a little bit too much. But if I can take a picture of a place that I'm observing and just kind of remind myself like where people are situated and, what is that physical space like? It can be a very helpful thing for you to do. As Blakesley and Fleischer say, with observations, it's one of those things that you just have to get in there and you need to start doing and trying. And this week you're going to do that. You're going to try doing an observation. Hopefully it can be something that's aligned with your project. If not, maybe have fun with it and choose something that's kind of off the wall. I'm going to leave that decision up to you. On page 110, there's some really helpful pointers about what things you observe. Because if you kind of slow down and make that familiar thing unfamiliar, it can get super overwhelming. I don't know about the Kroger where y'all are at. Our Kroger is crazy. It's great. I love that place. You meet tons of interesting people, different kinds of people, but there's a lot going on there. It is sensory overload. If you're just trying to observe everything, you're gonna miss the trees from the forest. So thinking about what kind of things should you observe, what kind of actions or details should you be keying in on, page 110 gives you some good ideas there. Description of the setting, talked about that a little bit. Interactions between people, actions, things that happen in that time that you're there observing, conversations that take place, all important things to kind of think about. Me, when I'm conducting research, I always try to tie things back to my research question and thinking about what kind of things do I need to observe to see the phenomenon that I'm trying to study. Maybe it's in the interactions between writing center tutors. Maybe it's in the interactions between a writing instructor and a student. And maybe it's the words that they say to each other, but maybe it's more like who has the paper in front of them. There's a lot of interesting studies in writing center studies that have used observations where they're observing a tutor and a student writer interact and clocking the amount of time that the piece of paper is in front of the student as opposed to the tutor. So thinking about if you're trying to decide what it is to observe, those 4 items, the description, interactions, actions, conversations, that's a helpful heuristic. But it's also helpful to think about, of those 4 things, where are you going to see that phenomena that you're trying to study, that thing that you want to learn about, that thing that you're curious about. Super long video, have a lot to say about this. Lots of great studies have used observations in the discipline. I've used them a little bit in writing center studies, and they're used there quite a bit, along with interviews and talk aloud protocols where you get writers to talk aloud about their writing process and their revision practices. Also, if you're interested in observations and where folks have used them, literacy studies. Literacy studies is huge, getting people to talk about their literacy practices, not just academic literacies, but also like quilt making and carpentry and those kinds of literacy practices, observing people and what they're doing and thinking about what are the literacy skills that have gone into them being able to do that work. That's tied to the discipline, uses observations quite a bit. Okay. This is clearly something I care about and something I'm excited about. So I'm super looking forward to seeing what you guys come up with and hearing more about your observations, and also checking in with you guys this week about your midterm project. That is it for now. So sorry this has taken so long. Bye for now.